The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished hulls of American battle tanks, arranged in perfect formation outside the National Tank Museum in Arizona. The metal behemoths stood like silent sentinels, each one bearing the scars and stories of conflicts that had shaped the nation's history. A crowd had gathered around a temporary stage where an American flag fluttered in the gentle desert breeze. Men and women in civilian clothes mingled with uniformed personnel, many sporting veterans' caps adorned with unit pins and campaign ribbons. At the center of it all stood Colonel John Iron Jack Harmon, tall and straight despite his 68 years. His weathered face had been sculpted by decades in the sun, wind, and dust of battlefields across the world. Though his hair had long since turned silver, his posture remained military perfect, and his eyes retained the sharp clarity of a man who had spent his life watching the horizon for threats. He adjusted his reading glasses and glanced down at his notes before looking back up at the assembled crowd. 40 years ago today, the United States Army introduced a tank that would change the face of modern warfare, Harmon began, his voice carrying across the hushed audience. The M60A3 Patton, codenamed Thunderbolt, wasn't just a weapon. It was a testament to American engineering, to the innovative spirit that has always defined our nation in times of peace and war. A murmur of appreciation rippled through the crowd, particularly among the older veterans who nodded in solemn agreement. Many had served aboard the very machines Harmon spoke of, their memories as vivid now as they had been decades ago. "I was a young lieutenant when I first climbed aboard a Thunderbolt," Harmon continued, his gaze drifting toward a gleaming M60A3 positioned prominently at the center of the display. Fresh out of West Point, more confidence than competence. A few knowing chuckles rose from the audience. "But that tank taught me more about leadership than any classroom ever could. When you command 4 men inside 30 tons of American steel, with the responsibility of protecting an entire column behind you, you learn quickly what matters and what doesn't." Harmon paused, his eyes scanning the crowd, connecting with fellow veterans who understood the weight of his words without need for elaboration. "But the story I wanted to tell you today isn't about the tanks everyone knows. It's about what came before. The unsung hero of American armor, the M60 Pioneer." Behind Harmon, a large screen illuminated with black and white photographs of an earlier prototype tank. The images showed a vehicle similar to the famous Patton series, but with subtle differences that only trained eyes would notice. The Pioneer program began as a response to intelligence reports about Soviet armor advancements in the early 1970s. 25 of these experimental tanks were built, each one a laboratory on tracks. Some of you here today might have seen them, perhaps even worked on them, but their full story has never been told. In the front row, an elderly man with thick glasses nodded slightly, his gnarled hands resting on a walking cane. The Pioneer featured revolutionary suspension systems, advanced armor configurations, and power distribution solutions that would later become standard in American tanks for generations to come. These 25 vehicles represented the bridge between the past and the future of American armored warfare. Harmon's voice grew more passionate as he spoke, his hands gesturing toward the historical images on the screen. For a moment, he was no longer the distinguished director of the Tank Museum, but once again the young officer who had witnessed history being forged in steel. "My grandfather commanded a Sherman in the Battle of the Bulge," Harmon said, his voice softening with pride. "My father led a Patton company in Vietnam, and I had the privilege of commanding Thunderbolts during Operation Desert Storm. 3 generations of Harmons, 3 generations of American tanks, one continuous legacy of service and sacrifice." The audience sat captivated, particularly the older men who nodded in silent understanding. This wasn't just a celebration of machines. It was an acknowledgement of the bonds between men who had lived, fought, and sometimes died inside these steel fortresses. As Harmon concluded his speech and the formal ceremony transitioned to an open exhibition, he stepped down from the podium, accepting handshakes and backslaps from fellow veterans. His assistant, a young Army veteran named Rachel Torres, approached with a bottle of water and a concerned expression. "Colonel, there's someone from the Pentagon on the phone. Says it's urgent." Harmon raised an eyebrow but nodded, excusing himself from the crowd. He made his way through the exhibition hall, past displays chronicling the evolution of American armor, from the clattering M4 Shermans of World War II to the technological marvels of modern Abrams tanks. Each exhibit had been meticulously curated under his direction during his 10-year tenure as museum director. In the privacy of his office, Harmon picked up the phone. "This is Harmon." The voice on the other end belonged to Brigadier General Wallace, an old comrade from Desert Storm days. "Jack, I wish this call was just to congratulate you on the anniversary, but I'm afraid I've got bad news." Harmon settled into his chair, tension creeping up his spine. "What's happened, Bill?" "The historical research program for the M60 Pioneer has been officially terminated. Budget cuts. The decision came down from Senator Collins's office this morning." Harmon's jaw tightened. That program was documenting critical developments in American armor technology. "We're preserving history that would otherwise be lost." "I know, Jack. I fought for it. But Collins made the call, and you know how much influence he has on the Armed Services Committee." "What about the remaining Pioneer tanks, the ones we were planning to restore for the museum?" A heavy silence preceded Wallace's response. "That's the worst part, Jack. They're slated for destruction. Scrap metal, all 5 remaining units." Harmon stood abruptly, his free hand clenching into a fist. "That's not just short-sighted, Bill. That's erasing history. Those tanks represent innovations that saved American lives. Collins is calling them failed prototypes not worth the storage costs. His exact words were museum pieces taking up valuable space and resources." The irony wasn't lost on Harmon. That's exactly what they should be, museum pieces, preserved for future generations. "I'm sorry, Jack. I thought you should hear it from me before the official announcement. The destruction order goes into effect in 90 days. After ending the call, Harmon remained motionless at his desk, staring at a framed photograph on the wall. It showed a much younger version of himself standing proudly atop an M60A3, surrounded by his crew in the Saudi desert, all of them alive and unaware of the battles that awaited them. The weight of history, both preserved and threatened, pressed down on his shoulders. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Colonel, there's someone here asking for you. Says he's an old colleague. Michael Thompson?" Harmon's expression brightened slightly. "Thompson, send him in." The man who entered moved slowly, aided by a wooden cane. His thin frame and stooped shoulders belied the sharp intelligence still evident in his eyes. Michael Thompson, 70 years old and formerly one of the Pentagon's most brilliant engineering minds, extended a weathered hand. "Jack Harmon, been a long time." Harmon clasped the offered hand firmly. 20 years at least, Mike. What brings you to our humble museum?" Thompson glanced over his shoulder to ensure the door was closed before answering. "Heard about your speech today, the Pioneer program. Thought it might be time we had a conversation about what those tanks really were." Something in Thompson's tone caused Harmon to pause. He gestured toward a chair. "Have a seat, Mike. Can I get you some coffee?" "Something stronger wouldn't go amiss, if you've got it." Harmon smiled, reaching into his desk drawer to retrieve a bottle of bourbon and 2 glasses. Some traditions never change. He poured 2 fingers in each glass and handed one to Thompson, "To old soldiers and old tanks." Thompson accepted the drink with a nod, and to secrets kept too long. He took a slow sip, savoring the burn before continuing. "I just heard through channels that Collins is shutting down the Pioneer research program, ordering the remaining tanks destroyed." Harmon's eyes narrowed. "News travels fast. I just found out myself." "I've been monitoring that program for years, Jack. Those tanks aren't just historical curiosities. They're evidence." "Evidence of what exactly?" Thompson set his glass down and leaned forward. "The Pioneer wasn't just another experimental model. It was part of a classified program codenamed Project Thunderbolt, a response to intelligence that the Soviets had made a quantum leap in tank design with their T-72. Harmon frowned. "I know all this, Mike. The official history is incomplete." Thompson interrupted. "Deliberately so. The Pioneer featured technologies that were decades ahead of their time. The 8-wheel suspension system alone represented a revolution in tank mobility that the Army is only now publicly acknowledging in their newest designs." "I'm not following you, Mike. Why would the Army classify innovations in suspension systems?" Thompson's expression grew grim. "Because the man who designed that system wasn't supposed to exist, officially speaking. And because admitting where some of our most critical tank technologies actually came from would mean rewriting the history books and reassigning credit where it's due. There are powerful people like Collins who have built careers taking credit for other men's work." Harmon's interest was fully engaged now. He leaned forward. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the Pioneer program wasn't a failure that led to the successful Thunderbolt. It was the success that got buried." Thompson reached into his jacket and withdrew a weathered manila envelope. I've kept these documents for 30 years against regulations and probably several laws. But with those tanks about to be destroyed, I can't stay silent any longer. He slid the envelope across the desk. This is the real story of Project Thunderbolt, declassified last month without fanfare. Most of the people who know what to look for are dead or retired. I only found out because I still have friends in the archives department. Harmon opened the envelope with careful hands, spreading its contents across his desk. Blueprints, test results, classified field reports, and photographs spilled out, each bearing faded security classifications and project code names. His eyes widened as he began to understand the scope of what he was seeing. The Pioneer suspension system bomb, he murmured, examining a detailed technical drawing. This is nearly identical to what we're using in the newest Abrams variants. Thompson nodded grimly. And the compartmentalized crew protection systems, too. The shell might look different, but the fundamentals haven't changed in 40 years. The Pioneer wasn't a stepping stone. It was the foundation that everything since has been built upon. Harmon held up a photograph showing a Pioneer tank navigating terrain that would have immobilized conventional designs of the era. Why keep this classified for so long? This is something we should be celebrating, not hiding. Politics, money, and reputations, Thompson said simply. The Pioneer program was expensive, and certain influential figures, including a younger Richard Collins, advocated shutting it down in favor of more conventional designs. When later tank models incorporated Pioneer innovations without attribution, those same people took credit for correcting the program's direction. Harmon sat back, processing the implications. And now those same people want to destroy the evidence. Exactly, with the tanks gone and the research program terminated, the real story stays buried. Thompson tapped one of the documents. Look at the chief designer's name on the suspension system. Harmon adjusted his glasses, reading the faded signature. William Jefferson? I don't recognize the name. You wouldn't. He was a brilliant engineer, African-American, came up through the Army Corps of Engineers. In 1972, the idea of a black man designing the fundamental systems for America's next generation of battle tanks didn't sit well with certain Pentagon officials. So his contributions were classified, subdivided, and eventually attributed to committee work. The revelation hit Harmon like a physical blow. As a military historian and museum director, he had dedicated his life to preserving and accurately telling the stories of American military technology. The thought that such a significant contribution had been deliberately obscured struck at the core of his professional identity. Is Jefferson still alive? Thompson shook his head slowly. Died 10 years ago, never received proper recognition for his work. But there are others from the original team still around, people who could verify all of this if given the chance. Harmon gathered the documents, his mind already racing ahead. Collins will bury this if he can. We need to move quickly. What are you thinking, Jack? Harmon stood, a sense of purpose straightening his spine even further. First, we need to locate every surviving Pioneer tank and document them thoroughly before they can be destroyed. Second, we gather everyone still living who worked on the program. And third, he paused, a determined glint in his eye. We tell the true story publicly, with so much evidence and testimony that even a senator can't bury it. Thompson smiled for the first time since entering the office. I was hoping you'd say something like that. I've already started a list of names, people from the original project who might be willing to speak up after all these years. Harmon nodded, his military mind already formulating strategy. We'll need to move fast. Collins won't waste time once he realizes what we're doing. There's one more thing you should know, Jack. Thompson's expression grew serious again. Collins isn't just acting out of pride or politics. There's a defense contractor involved, Next Gen Defense. They're developing a new light tank incorporating many of the Pioneer's innovations, but marketing them as brand new technologies. Collins sits on their board of directors. So it's not just about burying history, it's about profit. Millions in defense contracts based on stolen innovations they're passing off as their own. Harmon's jaw set in a hard line. Then we have even more reason to move quickly. I'll need a team. As if on cue, a knock sounded at the door, and Rachel poked her head in. Sorry to interrupt, Colonel, but your 4 o'clock is here. There's Sarah Miller from the Military History Department. Harmon exchanged a meaningful glance with Thompson. Perfect timing. Send her in, Rachel. And could you pull the service records for Frank Rodriguez and James Wilson? I need to make some calls. As Rachel withdrew, Thompson raised an eyebrow. Building your team already? Sarah Miller is the foremost historian on American armor development, and her late husband was a Pioneer test driver. Rodriguez was my crew chief in Desert Storm, best mechanical mind I've ever known. And Wilson actually drove a Pioneer during the Nevada field tests. You'll need someone with political clout, too, someone Collins can't easily dismiss. Harmon smiled thinly. I've got just the man. Colonel Robert Davis, retired, served on the Joint Chiefs, has a direct line to half the Senate Armed Services Committee, and owes me a favor from Baghdad. The door opened again to admit Dr. Sarah Miller, a distinguished woman in her early 60s with steel gray hair, pulled back in a practical bun, and intelligent eyes behind modern glasses. She carried herself with the confident poise of someone comfortable in both academic and military circles. Colonel Harmon, it's good to see you again. Her gaze shifted to Thompson with professional curiosity. I don't believe we've met. Dr. Miller, this is Michael Thompson, former chief engineer for the Army's Advanced Vehicle Systems Division. Mike, Dr. Sarah Miller, author of Steel Democracy, The Evolution of American Armor Doctrine. Recognition flashed in Miller's eyes. Mr. Thompson, your work on composite armor systems is legendary. I cited your papers extensively in my book. Only the unclassified ones, I hope, Thompson replied with a wry smile. Miller's expression sharpened with interest. Is there something I should know? Harmon gestured toward the documents spread across his desk. Sarah, how would you feel about writing a new chapter of American armor history? One that's been deliberately kept out of the official record? Her eyes lit with the unmistakable excitement of an academic presented with undiscovered source material. I'm listening. It involves the Pioneer program, Senator Collins, and a systematic effort to erase innovations that saved countless American lives. Miller's expression hardened. My husband died testing a Pioneer prototype. The official report called it mechanical failure, but he told me the day before that they were pushing the tanks beyond safety parameters on direct orders from Washington. Then you have a personal stake in this as well, Thompson observed quietly. We all do, Harmon said, standing to his full height. This isn't just about setting the historical record straight. It's about honoring the men who designed, built, and tested those tanks. It's about making sure their contributions aren't scrapped along with the evidence. For a moment, the office fell silent as the three veterans, one of combat, one of engineering, one of academic preservation, contemplated the task before them. They're calling it Operation Heritage, Harmon finally said, the familiar cadence of mission planning returning to his voice. And we have exactly 90 days before those tanks are melted down and this piece of American history is lost forever. Over the next 72 hours, Harmon worked tirelessly from his office at the museum, making calls, sending secure emails, and pulling strings accumulated over decades of military service. Rachel, quickly grasping the importance of the mission without needing all the details, efficiently coordinated the logistics, arranging for meeting rooms, secure communications, and travel authorizations. By Friday afternoon, Harmon's team had assembled in the museum's private conference room, a space normally reserved for visiting military dignitaries and major donors. Around the polished oak table sat the core of what Harmon had begun calling his Steel Guardians. Frank Doc Rodriguez arrived first, his barrel chest and powerful hands belying his 65 years. A former tank mechanic who had risen to chief warrant officer before retirement, Rodriguez had kept his mustache neatly trimmed even in civilian life. Gold-rimmed reading glasses perched incongruously on his broad nose as he pored over the technical documents Thompson had provided. Beautiful system, he murmured, examining the blueprint of the Pioneer suspension. Absolutely beautiful. I worked on Thunderbolts for 15 years and never knew half of this was inside them. James Wilson sat across from him, leaner and more reserved, his dark skin contrasting with close-cropped silver hair. At 59, the former tank driver now taught mechanical engineering at a community college in Texas. His fingers traced the outline of the Pioneer in one of the photographs with something approaching reverence. I remember how she handled, he said quietly. Different from anything before or since, like she could read your mind through the controls. Colonel Robert Bob Davis arrived last, still moving with the precise efficiency that had characterized his 30-year military career. At 70, his face carried the impassive dignity of a man accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. He nodded respectfully to Harmon before taking a seat at the table. Quite the fire team you've assembled, Jack, he observed dryly. I haven't seen this much combat experience in one room since the Pentagon during Desert Storm. Harmon remained standing, naturally assuming the role of briefing officer. Behind him, a digital display showed the locations of the 5 remaining Pioneer tanks, marked on a map of the United States. Gentlemen, Dr. Miller, thank you for coming on such short notice. I know you all have questions, so let me start with what we know for certain. He proceeded to outline the situation methodically. Senator Collins's order to terminate the Pioneer research program, the scheduled destruction of the remaining tanks, the classified history that Thompson had revealed, and the connection to Next Gen Defense's new tank program. In short, we're facing a deliberate attempt to erase a crucial chapter of American military innovation, partly for political reasons and partly for corporate profit. Harmon's voice remained measured, but the intensity in his eyes conveyed his personal stake in the mission. Davis leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. Collins has considerable influence, Jack. He's not a man who backs down easily, and he has allies throughout the Defense Department, which is why we need your connections, Bob. We need to build support among people Collins can't simply override or intimidate. Rodriguez tapped the technical drawings with a thick finger. These suspension and protection systems, they're still classified, aren't they? How can we publicly discuss them without landing in federal prison? Thompson, who had been quietly observing from the corner, spoke up. They were declassified last month along with most of the Pioneer program details. It was done quietly, buried in a massive document dump related to 1970s defense programs. Most people wouldn't know what to look for, but the information is now technically public. Convenient timing, Miller observed, right before ordering the tanks destroyed. Exactly, Harmon agreed. Clean up the paper trail, then eliminate the physical evidence. Corporate lawyers could argue that any similarities between Pioneer technologies and NextGen's new designs are coincidental, impossible to prove without the original tanks for comparison. Wilson shook his head slowly. So what's the plan, Colonel? We can't exactly steal 5 tanks from military bases. No, but we can document them thoroughly, gather testimony from everyone who worked with them, and create a comprehensive record that can't be erased. Harmon pointed to the map. We've identified all 5 remaining Pioneers, 2 at Fort Hood awaiting disposal, 1 command variant at the Armor School at Fort Benning, 1 hybrid model with experimental components at Aberdeen Proving Ground, and 1 in private hands at the Patton Military Collection in California. The California tank is safe then, Davis noted. For now, Thompson interjected. But NextGen's lawyers have already filed paperwork claiming it contains proprietary technology that was improperly disposed of. They're trying to force its return to Army control. Rodriguez whistled softly. They're thorough, I'll give them that. Our mission has 3 phases, Harmon continued, his voice taking on the familiar cadence of operational planning. First, we document every detail of those tanks before they can be destroyed. Second, we gather testimony from everyone still living who worked on the Pioneer program. And third, we create a documentary record so compelling and public that destroying those tanks becomes politically impossible. Davis nodded slowly. A media campaign, make it too visible to bury. Exactly. Dr. Miller will coordinate the historical documentation. Frank, I need you and James to handle the technical assessment of the tanks themselves. Bob, you'll work your contacts in Washington, finding us allies and keeping tabs on Collins's movements. And I'll focus on locating former Pioneer personnel and securing their testimonies. What about me? Thompson asked quietly. Harmon turned to the elderly engineer. You're our technical authority, Mike. No one knows those systems better than you do. I need you to verify the innovations and trace how they evolved into current technologies. Miller tapped her pen against her notepad. We should start with the 2 tanks at Fort Hood. They're the most immediately threatened. Agreed, Harmon said. I've already requested formal access for a final historical documentation before disposal. The base commander is an old friend, so we have a 10-day window starting Monday. And if Collins gets wind of what we're doing? Wilson asked. Harmon's expression hardened. Then we accelerate. This isn't just about tanks, people, it's about honor. The honor of the men who designed those machines, who tested them, and who never received proper recognition for innovations that saved American lives. I don't know about you, but I'm not willing to let that story be erased for political convenience or corporate profit. A murmur of agreement ran around the table, the shared determination of professionals who recognized the importance of preserving not just machines, but the human stories they represented. As the meeting concluded and team members dispersed to begin their assignments, Davis lingered behind, waiting until the room had cleared before addressing Harmon directly. This is personal for you, isn't it, Jack? beyond the historical significance. Harmon walked to the window, gazing out at the tanks displayed on the museum grounds below. For a moment, he seemed to be looking at something much further away, both in distance and time. You know, I commanded thunderbolts in Desert Storm. What you might not know is that my tank took a direct hit from an Iraqi T-72 during the Battle of 73 Easting. Davis's eyebrows rose slightly. I didn't know that. The shell hit us at an angle that should have penetrated the crew compartment. By all rights, my gunner and loader should have died instantly. Harmon's voice had grown quiet, almost reverent. But they didn't. The round deflected. Just enough. We were knocked out of the fight, but my crew walked away. He turned back to face Davis. Years later, I learned our survival wasn't luck. It was the result of specific design elements first tested in the Pioneer program. The angled deflection surfaces inside the armor composition. Someone I never knew, someone whose name was buried in classified documents, made design decisions that saved my men that day. Davis nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. So this isn't just about historical accuracy. It's about debt, Harmon said simply. A debt of honor to the people who made those tanks better than they needed to be. Better than the Pentagon was even asking for. And I'll be damned if I let Collins and his corporate friends bury that story for profit. Davis placed a hand on Harmon's shoulder. Then we'd better get to work. Collins has a head start and a lot of resources. But we have something he doesn't, Harmon replied, resolve hardening his voice. What's that? The truth, and people willing to fight for it. As Davis departed, Harmon remained in the conference room, studying the map with its 5 marked locations. Each point represented not just a tank, but a nexus of human innovation, sacrifice, and unrecognized achievement. In his mind's eye, he could see the faces of his own tank crew from Desert Storm. Young men who had trusted their lives to the steel and systems surrounding them, never knowing the full story of those who had designed their protection. A memory surfaced, vivid and visceral, of sand and smoke, and the deafening impact of an enemy round striking his tank. The sudden darkness as systems failed, the acrid smell of damaged electronics, and the miraculous realization that his crew had survived what should have been a fatal hit. Harmon had spent decades telling the stories of American armor, the famous battles, the legendary commanders, the technical innovations that dominated battlefields across the world. But now he faced the possibility that a crucial chapter of that story, perhaps the most important one, might be lost forever. His phone vibrated with an incoming message. Rachel had sent confirmation that their travel arrangements to Fort Hood were complete. The mission was underway. Outside the window, the afternoon sun gleamed on the hulls of historic tanks, each one preserved as a testament to American engineering and the courage of those who had fought inside them. Harmon's gaze settled on a Thunderbolt displayed prominently near the museum entrance, its battle-scarred exterior restored to its Desert Storm configuration. For a moment, he saw not just the tank, but the faces of the young men who had crewed it, their fears, their determination, their trust in each other and in the machine that carried them into combat. Behind those faces were others, unseen and unacknowledged, the engineers, the designers, the test drivers who had made that trust possible through innovations that prioritize crew survival above all else. Your story will be told, Harmon promised quietly, his words meant for ears long since beyond hearing. All of it. That evening, as Harmon packed his briefcase in preparation for the trip to Fort Hood, his phone rang. The caller ID showed a restricted number. Harmon, he answered, balancing the phone between ear and shoulder as he continued organizing documents. Colonel, this is Brigadier General Wallace again. I'm calling to give you a heads up. Senator Collins knows you've been accessing the Pioneer files. Harmon paused, his full attention now on the call. That didn't take long. How did he find out? Your document request triggered an automated flag in the system. Collins apparently had security markers placed on anything related to the Pioneer program. I appreciate the warning, Bill. How much time do we have before he moves to block us? Hard to say. He's in Europe for a NATO conference until Tuesday, so you've got at least that long. But Jack, Wallace hesitated. Collins has friends in places you don't want to make enemies. Be careful how you proceed. Understood, and thank you. After ending the call, Harmon sat at his desk, contemplating this new information. Collins's reaction confirmed what Thompson had suggested. There was something in the Pioneer program that powerful people wanted to keep buried. The question was whether their small team could uncover and document enough evidence before opposition mobilized against them. His contemplation was interrupted by another call, this time from James Wilson. "Colonel, I've been reviewing these technical specifications and something doesn't add up." Harmon shifted mental gears. "What have you found?" "The suspension system, it's not just innovative for the 1970s, it's revolutionary. The adaptive response rate, the load distribution algorithms. This is technology we're only now implementing in the latest generation of combat vehicles. It's like finding a smartphone in the 1980s. Could it have been ahead of its time? Concepts that couldn't be fully implemented with the technology available then?" "That's just it, sir. According to these test results, they did implement it. The Pioneer prototypes were outperforming everything else in the field by significant margins, especially in difficult terrain." Harmon frowned, processing this new information. If the results were that impressive, why shelve the program? "That's what doesn't make sense. By every metric I can see, the Pioneer should have been fast-tracked for production, not buried. Unless the decision wasn't based on performance." "Exactly what I was thinking, sir. Something else was at play." After ending the call, Harmon leaned back in his chair, pieces of the puzzle rearranging themselves in his mind. The Pioneer program hadn't been shelved because of technical failures or budget constraints. Those were the official reasons. But the evidence suggested a different story, one of internal politics, racial barriers, and career advancement built on suppressing others' achievements. His phone buzzed with a text message from Rachel. "Flight to Austin confirmed for 0700. Car will be waiting at Fort Hood. Security clearances processed." The mission was moving forward, but Harmon couldn't shake the feeling that they were stirring up forces more powerful than anticipated. Collins wasn't just protecting his reputation. He was safeguarding a narrative that had shaped military procurement for decades. As darkness fell outside his office window, Harmon found himself staring at the photograph of his Desert Storm tank crew once more. Young faces, smiling despite the dust and exhaustion, unaware of the political machinations that had shaped the very machine that protected them. Unaware that the tank innovations saving their lives had been developed by men whose names had been deliberately obscured from military history. In that moment, Harmon's resolve crystallized into something harder than the composite armor of the tanks he had commanded. This wasn't just about preserving artifacts or correcting historical records. It was about justice for the unnamed innovators whose work had saved countless American lives, including his own. Tomorrow, they would begin documenting the physical evidence before it could be destroyed. The race against time and against powerful interests determined to maintain their version of history had begun. Harmon closed his briefcase with a definitive click. Whatever forces Collins might bring to bear, the mission would proceed. Some debts transcended politics, rank, and time itself. Some truths demanded to be told, regardless of the cost. Outside, the desert night had fallen completely, stars emerging in the clear Arizona sky. On the museum grounds below, security lights illuminated the silent ranks of historic tanks, each one a chapter in America's military story. If Harmon and his team succeeded, those ranks would include the pioneers, not as footnotes or failed experiments, but as the revolutionary innovations they truly were, along with the names of those who had created them. If they failed, a crucial piece of American innovation would disappear into industrial furnaces. The truth melted down along with the steel that embodied it. Either way, Harmon knew, the next 90 days would determine whether history remembered the full story of American armor or only the convenient, curated version that powerful men had decided should be preserved. With that thought weighing on his mind, he switched off his office light and stepped into the hallway, where tomorrow's battle awaited. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Hood's massive vehicle storage yard as Colonel John Harmon's team stepped from their rental SUV. Rows of decommissioned military vehicles stretched before them, a mechanical graveyard of machines that had once carried America's fighting forces across battlefields around the world. In the distance, active duty tanks conducted training exercises, their low rumbles carrying across the Texas plain. Harmon shielded his eyes against the glare, scanning the facility for their contact. Despite the civilian clothes, his military bearing remained unmistakable, shoulders squared and posture erect even at 68. Beside him, Frank Rodriguez squinted at a clipboard, checking serial numbers against their documentation. "They should be in Section D7, Rodriguez muttered, his thick fingers tracing a path on the facility map. "Scheduled for processing next month." Sarah Miller adjusted her camera, the expensive digital equipment hanging from a strap around her neck. Processing, such a clinical term for destruction. James Wilson said nothing, his attention fixed on the distant sound of tank engines. For a former driver, the distinctive mechanical symphony held meaning beyond words, like music that only initiates could truly appreciate. A young Army captain approached, offering a crisp salute before catching himself and extending his hand instead. "Colonel Harmon, Captain Reynolds, the base commander asked me to escort you, said to give you whatever you need for your historical documentation." Harmon shook the offered hand firmly. "Appreciate that, Captain. We won't get in your way. Just need access to the 2 Pioneer prototypes and permission to thoroughly document them before they're scrapped." Reynolds nodded, gesturing for them to follow. "Right this way, sir. They're in the restricted section, along with other classified equipment awaiting disposition." As they walked, Reynolds maintained a respectful silence, clearly aware of Harmon's reputation. The younger officer's occasional glances spoke volumes about the honor he felt in escorting a decorated combat veteran. After passing through a security checkpoint, they entered a fenced compound where various experimental and specialized vehicles stood in neat rows. At the far end, partially covered by weathered tarps, sat 2 M60 Pioneer tanks, their distinctive profiles immediately recognizable to the trained observers. "There they are," Wilson whispered, his voice carrying a reverence that transcended the utilitarian surroundings. "Numbers 04 and 17. For a moment, none of them moved, each processing the significance of the machines before them. These weren't just tanks. They were physical embodiments of American innovation, the products of brilliant minds whose contributions had been deliberately obscured. Harmon approached the nearest tank, pulling back the tarp to reveal the commander's cupola. His hand rested on the metal surface, feeling the connection across decades to the men who had designed, built, and tested this revolutionary machine. "Let's get to work," he said finally, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of emotion. "Frank, start with the suspension system. James, document the engine compartment. Dr. Miller, exterior photos and dimensions. I'll handle the interior and command systems." For the next several hours, they worked methodically, documenting every detail of the 2 Pioneer tanks. Rodriguez crawled beneath the massive vehicles, his experienced hands examining the revolutionary 8-wheel suspension system that had given the Pioneer unprecedented mobility over difficult terrain. "This is incredible," he called from beneath the tank, voice echoing in the confined space. "The load distribution system is unlike anything I've ever seen. Each wheel can adjust independently to terrain changes. We're only now implementing similar systems in the newest Abrams variants." Wilson had opened the engine compartment, meticulously photographing and measuring components. "The power distribution is revolutionary too. Look at how they channeled cooling efficiency. This design solved problems we were still struggling with a decade later." Inside the commander's position, Harmon familiarized himself with controls that felt both foreign and strangely familiar. The Pioneer's interior layout differed from the tanks he had commanded, yet the underlying philosophy of crew protection and combat efficiency was immediately apparent. He ran his fingers over a manufacturer's plate, cleaning away decades of grime to reveal the serial number and production date. Dr. Miller circled both tanks repeatedly, her camera clicking steadily as she captured high-resolution images from every angle. Her trained historian's eye noted details that might escape even experienced tankers. The subtle design evolutions that connected these machines to both their predecessors and descendants. As the afternoon wore on, Captain Reynolds returned, accompanied by an older man in civilian clothes. "Colonel Harmon, this is Mr. Peterson from the Technical Documentation Office. He says he has some files you might find relevant to your work." The man approached cautiously, clutching a thick folder stamped with faded security classifications. "Colonel, I understand you're documenting the Pioneer program. I worked in records during the original testing phase. When I heard you were here," he glanced around nervously before continuing, "there are documents that never made it into the official record. I kept copies, probably against regulations, but I always felt these machines deserved better than they got." Harmon accepted the folder with a nod of appreciation. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Your contribution might be more important than you know." After the man departed, Harmon opened the folder, revealing test data, field reports, and personal notes from the original Pioneer trials. His eyes widened as he scanned the contents. "These are the Nevada testing results. The complete set, not the redacted versions Thompson showed us." The team gathered around as Harmon spread the documents across the hood of their vehicle. The papers revealed performance data far exceeding what had been reported in official histories. showing the Pioneer outperforming contemporary Soviet tanks in nearly every category. Look at the mobility ratings, Park Wilson said, pointing to a chart comparing the Pioneer to the Soviet T-72. 30% better cross-country speed, 40% better obstacle navigation. This tank was revolutionary. Miller studied another document, her historian's training immediately recognizing its significance. These are the original design parameters signed by William Jefferson himself. His vision was decades ahead of its time. So why was the program shelved? Rodriguez asked, the question that had haunted them all finally voiced aloud. The answer came from another document in the stack, a memo from then-Colonel Richard Collins to the procurement board. Harmon read it aloud, his voice tightening with each word. While the prototype demonstrates certain technical advantages, the projected production costs exceed budgetary constraints. Further, the unconventional design elements represent unnecessary departures from established armored doctrine. Recommendation: terminate program and redirect resources to conventional platform improvements. Wilson shook his head in disgust. Unconventional design elements. You mean the innovations that saved lives in every conflict since? Collins buried this program to advance his own career, Harmon said, the pieces finally falling into place. The conventional improvements he championed were easier to explain to congressional committees, easier to take credit for, and when those improvements inevitably incorporated pioneer innovations, the original source had been conveniently erased from the record. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the storage yard, they packed their equipment and prepared to depart. The documentation was only beginning, but already they had gathered more evidence than expected. Captain Reynolds approached as they finished. Colonel, I've been instructed to inform you that your clearance for tomorrow has been revoked. Orders from the Pentagon. Harmon's expression remained neutral, but his eyes hardened. I see. May I ask why? Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. Sir, the message came directly from Senator Collins's office. Something about a security review of historical documentation protocols. That didn't take long, Rodriguez muttered under his breath. Harmon nodded, unsurprised. Thank you for letting us know, Captain. We've gathered what we need for today. As they drove away from the base, the mood in the vehicle was somber but determined. Collins had made his first countermove, but they had anticipated this response. What mattered was that they had secured crucial documentation and established the connection between Collins's early career and the deliberate suppression of the Pioneer program. He knows we're on to something, Miller said, reviewing the photographs on her camera's display. Otherwise, why move so quickly to block our access? Harmon's phone rang, Thompson's name appearing on the screen. Mike, we've just finished at Fort Hood. Collins has already moved to block further access. I'm not surprised, Thompson replied, his voice tense. But we have bigger problems. Next Gen Defense has just filed an emergency motion claiming the Pioneer tanks contain proprietary technology. They're demanding immediate transfer to a secure facility under their supervision. On what grounds? Those tanks are government property. They're claiming some of the systems were developed under private contracts that granted ownership rights to the original technologies. It's nonsense legally, but it could tie things up in court long enough for the disposal order to proceed. Harmon considered the implications. How much time do we have? The hearing is scheduled for next week, but there's more. The private collection tank in California? NextGen sent representatives yesterday with similar claims. The owner called me, worried about potential legal consequences. Collins is moving faster than we anticipated. We need to accelerate our timeline. After ending the call, Harmon shared the news with the team. The strategy was clear. Divide their forces to document as much as possible before legal maneuvers could block them entirely. Frank, you and James head to Aberdeen tomorrow. Document the hybrid model before they can restrict access. Dr. Miller and I will go to Fort Benning for the command variant. We'll reconvene in 3 days to assess our progress. That evening, in a modest hotel conference room, they had converted into a makeshift command center. The team organized their findings. Photos, measurements, and technical data covered the walls, gradually assembling a comprehensive picture of the Pioneer program's true significance. Rodriguez spread the mechanical diagrams across the table, his expert eye identifying innovations that had silently revolutionized American tank design. The suspension system alone should have earned Jefferson a place in military engineering history. Look at how he solved the oscillation problem that plagued every tank before this. Pure genius. Wilson nodded in agreement, pointing to another diagram. And the crew compartmentalization. See how he redesigned the internal layout to channel blast energy away from personnel. That exact system saved countless lives in Iraq and Afghanistan, but I've never seen Jefferson credited anywhere. Miller was piecing together a timeline from the newly discovered documents in her own historical research. The pattern becomes clear when you see it all laid out. Each time a pioneer innovation was incorporated into mainstream tank development, someone else received credit, usually someone connected to Collins. Harmon's phone rang again, this time showing Colonel Davis's number. "Bob, what's the situation in Washington?" "Not good, Jack. Collins is mobilizing serious resources. He's scheduled an Armed Services Committee review of historical documentation procedures, obviously aimed at restricting your access. And he's lined up allies at the Pentagon to classify anything related to Pioneer under national security protocols. Can you slow him down?" "I'm working on it. I've reached out to Senator Martinez, who owes me from our Baghdad days. She's agreed to delay the committee review, citing procedural concerns. That buys us maybe a week. We'll take whatever time we can get. Any progress on finding Jefferson's family?" "His widow died 3 years ago, but I located his son in Philadelphia. William Jefferson Jr., he's a civil engineer, ironically enough. Seems to have inherited his father's talent. Have you contacted him?" "Not yet. Thought you might want to handle that personally, given the situation." Harmon agreed, making plans to call Jefferson's son the following morning. If anyone had a right to know the truth about the Pioneer program, it was the family of the man whose genius had been deliberately erased from military history. As they concluded their evening's work, Harmon found himself standing alone by the window, gazing out at the Texas night. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just about tanks or historical accuracy anymore. It was about justice for men like William Jefferson, whose contributions had been systematically erased for others' advancement. A memory surfaced from Desert Storm, vivid and visceral. His Thunderbolt tank, advancing through swirling sand as Iraqi shells fell around them. The sudden impact, the gut-wrenching knowledge that they'd been hit, followed by the miraculous realization that his crew had survived. He remembered the investigation afterward, the technical explanation of how the shell had been deflected by design elements incorporated years earlier. Design elements he now knew that William Jefferson had created. How many other tank crews had survived similar hits because of innovations whose origins had been deliberately obscured? How many families still had fathers, sons, husbands because of work that had never been properly acknowledged? His resolve hardened. Whatever resources Collins might bring to bear, whatever legal or political obstacles might arise, the truth of the Pioneer program would be revealed. He owed that much to Jefferson, to the men who had served under him, and to the historical record itself. The following morning brought another complication. As Harmon prepared to depart for Fort Benning with Dr. Miller, his phone rang with a call from the museum's assistant director. "Colonel, there's a man from the Department of Defense Inspector General's office here. He's demanding access to all your files related to the Pioneer program, citing a possible security breach." Harmon's jaw tightened. "Stall him, Rachel. Tell him I'm away from the museum on research and all relevant files are with me. I'll contact the IG's office directly." After ending the call, he turned to Miller. "Collins is casting a wide net. We need to move faster." She nodded, already gathering her equipment. "I've downloaded all our documentation to secure backup locations. Even if they seize our primary materials, the evidence is preserved." As they drove to the airport, Harmon called Davis with an update. "Bob, Collins is now involving the Inspector General claiming security breaches. Can you run interference?" "Already on it. I spoke with Lieutenant General Phillips at the Pentagon this morning. He's sympathetic to our cause and has agreed to slow walk any IG investigation. Says he always thought the Pioneer got a raw deal. That's something, at least." "How about Jefferson's son?" "I've arranged for you to meet him tomorrow in Philadelphia. He's cautious, but interested." While Harmon and Miller flew to Georgia to examine the command variant at Fort Benning, Rodriguez and Wilson arrived at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. The facility, long serving as a testing site for Army vehicles and weapons, housed the most unique of the remaining Pioneer tanks, a hybrid model combining elements from different development phases. The Aberdeen tank presented challenges from the start. Unlike at Fort Hood, the base commander had received specific instructions regarding the team's visit. "I can give you 2 hours with the vehicle," the major in charge explained apologetically, "and I'm required to have technical staff present at all times to ensure no classified components are photographed." Rodriguez, never one for diplomacy, frowned at the restriction. "Son, I held a security clearance when you were still in diapers. What exactly do you think we're going to do with a 40-year-old tank design? The major remained professional but firm. Just following orders, Chief. Senator Collins's office was very specific about protocols. Despite the limitations, they worked efficiently, focusing on the hybrid tank's most unique features. This particular Pioneer combined the experimental suspension system with an advanced turret design that had never been implemented in production models. Wilson slipped into the driver's compartment, his hands instinctively finding the controls. "This feels like coming home," he murmured, muscle memory from decades earlier returning as he familiarized himself with the layout. The technical observer assigned to monitor them watched with growing interest as Rodriguez methodically documented the suspension system, occasionally asking questions that revealed his own fascination with the unique design. "I've been stationed here 3 years," the young sergeant admitted during a brief pause. "Always wondered about this tank. The design is different from anything in the current inventory." Rodriguez seized the opening. Different because it was ahead of its imam. The man who designed this suspension system solved problems we're still dealing with in modern tanks. The sergeant leaned closer, professional caution momentarily overcome by technical curiosity. "Is it true what they say, that this tank outperformed the Abrams in cross-country trials?" "Not just outperformed it," Wilson joined in, emerging from the driver's hatch. "Left it in the dust, especially in rough terrain. The adaptive suspension system could handle obstacles that would stop most tracked vehicles cold." "Then why wasn't it adopted?" The question hung in the air, the central mystery of their entire mission. Rodriguez exchanged a meaningful glance with Wilson before answering carefully. "Politics, son. Sometimes the best designs don't win because the wrong people get credit." By the time their allotted 2 hours expired, they had gathered crucial documentation of the hybrid model's unique features, along with something equally valuable: the interest of a young Army technician who promised to look around for any additional documentation that might be stored in the facility's archives. At Fort Benning, Harmon and Miller encountered similar restrictions, but benefited from the base historian's personal interest in their project. The command variant Pioneer, modified specifically for battlefield management, contained communication systems far advanced for its era. The integrated data processing capabilities were at least a decade ahead of anything else in the field, the historian explained, showing them through the modified interior. This tank could coordinate an entire company's movements in real time, sharing targeting data across platforms. We didn't see similar capabilities again until the late 1980s. Miller documented everything meticulously, her trained eye capturing details that connected the command variant to later developments in battlefield management systems. "The architectural similarities to current systems are unmistakable," she observed. "You can trace a direct line from this design to what we're using today." Harmon focused on the human element, interviewing 2 retired officers who had worked with the command variant during its testing phase. Their testimonies added crucial perspective to the growing body of evidence. "That tank changed how we thought about battlefield coordination," one retired colonel explained, his weathered face animated with the memory. "For the first time, a commander could maintain situational awareness across the entire battle space while remaining mobile. It was revolutionary." By the evening of the 3rd day, as the team reconvened at their hotel in Washington, D.C., the scale of what they had uncovered was becoming clear. The Pioneer program hadn't been merely another experimental tank design. It had represented a fundamental paradigm shift in armored warfare, introducing concepts and technologies that would define American combat vehicles for generations. And at the center of it all was William Jefferson, the brilliant engineer whose name had been systematically erased from the historical record. "Tomorrow we meet his son," Harmon told the assembled team, his voice solemn with the responsibility. "We need to be prepared for any reaction. He may not know the full extent of his father's contributions." Rodriguez shook his head slowly. "How do you tell a man that his father's life's work is stolen, that innovations that saved thousands of American lives have been credited to others for decades?" "With respect," Harmon replied simply, "and with evidence." The following morning, Harmon and Davis traveled to Philadelphia to meet William Jefferson, Jr. The younger Jefferson had agreed to a meeting at his engineering firm's offices, a modern building overlooking the Schuylkill River. At 55, William Jr. shared his father's broad shoulders and thoughtful expression, though his hair had already turned mostly gray. He greeted them with professional courtesy but obvious caution. "Gentlemen, I appreciate you coming all this way, but I'm still not clear on why the Army is suddenly interested in my father's work after all these years." He passed away a decade ago. Harmon chose his words carefully. Mr. Jefferson, we're not here in an official capacity. We're conducting independent historical research into the Pioneer tank program from the 1970s. Jefferson's expression remained guarded. My father rarely discussed his military work. Even after retirement, said it was classified. Much of it was, Davis confirmed. But recently declassified documents have revealed your father's central role in developing technologies that transformed American armored warfare. Technologies that have saved countless lives in combat. Jefferson studied them for a moment, assessing their sincerity. What exactly are you hoping to find from me? I don't have any of his work papers. The Army collected everything when he died. We're not looking for documents, Harmon said gently. We're trying to restore your father's rightful place in military history. His contributions were deliberately obscured, and others took credit for his innovations. Something shifted in Jefferson's expression. Surprise mixed with a long-harbored suspicion finally confirmed. He used to say something like that. Late in his life, after a few drinks, he'd mutter about them stealing my wheels. I never knew exactly what he meant. Harmon opened his briefcase and removed the technical drawings they had discovered, spreading them across Jefferson's desk. He meant this: the 8-wheel suspension system that revolutionized tank mobility. Your father designed it, but his name was removed from the official record. Jefferson stared at the drawings, recognition dawning in his eyes. I've seen these before, in his home office. When I was a boy, he had sketches that looked just like these. Your father was a genius, Mr. Jefferson. The suspension system he designed is still being used in modified form in today's combat vehicles. It's saved countless lives by giving tanks the mobility to avoid threats and navigate battlefield obstacles. For several moments, Jefferson said nothing, absorbing the implications of what he was hearing. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a mixture of pride and long-suppressed anger. Why would they erase his contribution? Davis answered, his tone measured but direct. Politics, career advancement, and racism. In the 1970s, the idea of an African-American engineer designing critical systems for America's premier battle tanks didn't fit certain narratives. So his work was classified, subdivided, and eventually attributed to committee efforts or other individuals. And you can prove this? Harmon nodded solemnly. We can. We've been documenting the remaining Pioneer tanks before they're destroyed. The evidence is irrefutable. Jefferson leaned back in his chair, processing everything he'd heard. Destroyed? They're destroying the tanks my father helped design? That's the immediate issue, Davis explained. Senator Richard Collins has ordered the 5 remaining Pioneers scrapped. We believe it's to eliminate physical evidence of your father's innovations, which would undermine decades of historical narrative and possibly affect current defense contracts. For several long moments, Jefferson sat in silence, staring at the technical drawings that represented his father's genius. When he finally looked up, determination had replaced uncertainty in his eyes. What do you need from me? The question marked a turning point in their mission. With Jefferson's support, they gained not just moral authority, but a direct familial connection to the program's true origins. He provided photographs, personal letters, and most critically, his father's private journals, which detailed the development process of the Pioneer's revolutionary systems in the engineer's own words. He kept these hidden, Jefferson explained, handing over 3 leather-bound volumes. Said they were his insurance policy in case the truth ever needed to be told. The journals proved invaluable, containing not just technical details but personal observations about the political maneuvering that had ultimately buried the Pioneer program. William Jefferson Sr. had documented meetings, conversations, and decisions that created a clear picture of how his innovations had been systematically appropriated by others, including the younger Richard Collins, then an ambitious colonel with political connections. Armed with this new evidence, the team reconvened in Washington to consolidate their findings and develop their strategy for the coming confrontation. Thompson joined them, bringing additional technical analysis that connected Pioneer innovations directly to systems currently being marketed by next-gen defense as proprietary technologies. The parallels are unmistakable, Thompson explained, comparing technical specifications side by side. Next-gen's new suspension system is functionally identical to Jefferson's design, just updated with modern materials. They're claiming it as a breakthrough when it's really a refinement of work done 40 years ago. Davis, leveraging his Pentagon connections, had discovered the scheduled destruction date for the Fort Hood tanks had been moved up, now just 3 weeks away instead of the original 90 days. Collins is accelerating everything, and he reported grimly. He knows we're gathering evidence and wants the physical tanks eliminated before we can complete our documentation. Harmon paced the room, considering their options. The legal hearing regarding NextGen's claims was scheduled for the following week, potentially placing the tanks under corporate control before they could be properly documented for historical purposes. We need leverage, he said finally, something that makes destroying those tanks politically untenable. Miller, who had been quietly reviewing her historical documentation, looked up with a thoughtful expression. What about the Nevada tests, the sealed records Jefferson mentioned in his journals? Thompson's eyes widened with recognition. The comparative trials, where they pitted the Pioneer against captured Soviet equipment. Exactly. According to Jefferson's notes, the Pioneer outperformed everything on the field that day, including our own Abrams prototypes. If those results became public, Harmon nodded slowly, understanding the strategy. It would raise obvious questions about why such a successful design was abandoned. Questions that would lead directly to Collins and his allies. The records should still exist in the Army Testing Command archives, Davis said, but they'll be classified, possibly under special access protocols. Can you get to them? Davis considered the question carefully. Not directly, but I know someone who might be able to help. Lieutenant General Phillips, the one who's been running interference for us at the Pentagon. He commanded Testing Command before his current assignment. While Davis pursued that angle, Rodriguez and Wilson prepared for another critical mission, examining the privately owned Pioneer tank in California before NextGen could gain control of it through legal maneuvers. The Patton military collection outside San Diego housed one of the most comprehensive assemblages of American armor in private hands. Its owner, Howard Patton, a distant relative of the famous general and successful defense contractor, had acquired Pioneer number 09 a decade earlier when it was mistakenly included in a lot of surplus equipment. Despite NextGen's attempts to intimidate him with legal threats, Patton welcomed Rodriguez and Wilson warmly, eager to learn more about the unique vehicle in his collection. Always knew this one was special, the elderly collector said, leading them through his immaculate facility to where the Pioneer stood, restored to operational condition. Different from any other tank in my collection, the way it moves, the way the suspension adapts to terrain. My mechanics say it's at least 20 years ahead of its contemporaries. This particular Pioneer had an especially significant history. As Wilson discovered from the vehicle's logbooks, it had been Jefferson's personal test platform during the development phase, containing several experimental features that had never been implemented in other prototypes. "Look at this," Wilson called from the driver's compartment, pointing to a small metal plate affixed beneath the main controls. Unlike the standard manufacturer's plates, this one bore a simple inscription, WJ System, let no terrain stop the defender of freedom. The discovery sent a ripple of excitement through the team. Here was tangible, physical evidence of Jefferson's direct involvement, a personal signature that couldn't be explained away as committee work or coincidental design similarity. Rodriguez meticulously documented every aspect of the tank, focusing particularly on components that matched designs in Jefferson's journals. The correlation was undeniable, creating a clear lineage from Jefferson's original concepts to implemented technologies. Patton, increasingly intrigued by their findings, offered unexpected support. NextGen's lawyers have been pressuring me to turn over this tank, claiming it contains proprietary systems. Now I understand why. The elderly collector's expression hardened with resolve. They'll get this tank over my dead body. It belongs in a museum, with proper credit to its designer. By the time Rodriguez and Wilson returned to Washington, Davis had made significant progress accessing the Nevada test records. Through General Phillips, he had obtained limited clearance to review the sealed reports, revealing exactly what Collins had been desperate to keep hidden. The team gathered in their makeshift command center, now relocated to a more secure location in Davis's private office, to review the explosive findings. The Nevada comparative trials were conducted in 1978, Davis explained, spreading the declassified documents across the conference table. The Pioneer was tested against captured Soviet T-72s, as well as against our own M1 Abrams prototypes. Harmon leaned forward, studying the performance charts with growing amazement. These results are extraordinary. The Pioneer outperformed everything on the field in almost every category. Mobility, survivability, target acquisition. The Pioneer dominated across the board, Thompson confirmed, his engineer's eye assessing the technical data. The only area where the Abrams held an advantage was in main gun performance, which wasn't even part of Jefferson's design focus. Miller, correlating the test results with budget documents from the same period, identified the critical connection. Look at this. 1 week after these tests, Collins submitted his report recommending termination of the Pioneer program and reallocation of funding to the Abrams development. He buried the results, Harmon said, the final piece falling into place. Suppressed Jefferson's innovations to advance his own preferred program, where he had political allies and, I suspect, financial interests. The evidence was damning, painting a clear picture of how a revolutionary tank design had been deliberately shelved to advance personal careers and political agendas, at the cost of technological advancement that could have saved even more American lives in subsequent conflicts. As they organized their findings into a comprehensive presentation, Harmon received an unexpected call from Captain Reynolds at Fort Hood. "Colonel Harmon, I thought you should know. Orders came down today to accelerate the disposal of the Pioneer tanks. They're being moved to the scrapyard tomorrow morning." Tomorrow? That's weeks ahead of schedule. "Yes, sir. Special instructions from the Pentagon. Very unusual protocols, too. Armed guards, no documentation allowed, complete media blackout." After thanking Reynolds for the warning, Harmon addressed the team with renewed urgency. "Collins is making his move. We're out of time for the legal approach." Davis frowned, considering the implications. "What are you suggesting, Jack? We can't physically prevent the Army from disposing of its own equipment." "No, but we can make sure the world knows exactly what's being destroyed and why." Harmon's eyes gleamed with determination. "It's time to go public, all of it. Jefferson's story, the Nevada tests, Collins's manipulation of the program, and NextGen's attempt to claim technologies they didn't create." The strategy carried significant risks. Going public meant potentially angering powerful figures in the defense establishment and exposing themselves to accusations of improper disclosure of military information. But with the tanks about to be destroyed, they had run out of alternatives. Miller, who had been quietly working on her laptop, looked up with unexpected news. "I might have a better option. I just heard from my contact at the Smithsonian. The American History Museum is preparing a major exhibition on African American contributions to military technology. They're very interested in William Jefferson's story." "The Smithsonian," Rodriguez said thoughtfully. "That changes the equation. Collins can bully Pentagon bureaucrats, but going against the Smithsonian would mean fighting a beloved American institution." "Exactly," Miller confirmed. "And they're willing to make a formal request for at least one Pioneer tank to be transferred to their collection for permanent display, with full attribution to Jefferson. Such requests are rarely denied, especially with congressional support." Davis immediately grasped the political implications. Senator Martinez could sponsor the request. As a member of both the Armed Services Committee and the Congressional Black Caucus, her support would make it very difficult for Collins to interfere without exposing his motives. For the first time in days, Harmon allowed himself a moment of optimism. The Smithsonian request offered a path to preserving at least one Pioneer tank, ensuring Jefferson's contribution would be permanently acknowledged in one of the nation's most prestigious museums. But the battle was far from over. Collins still controlled the immediate fate of the tanks at Fort Hood, and NextGen's legal claim against the California tank remained active. They needed to move quickly, coordinating multiple fronts simultaneously. "Bob, contact Martinez immediately. We need that Smithsonian request formalized before the tanks are destroyed." Harmon turned to Miller. "Sarah, prepare a comprehensive historical brief for the museum curators. Make sure they understand the full significance of Jefferson's work." To Rodriguez and Wilson, he assigned the most delicate task. "Frank James, I need you to return to Fort Hood, not to interfere with the disposal process, but to ensure complete documentation before those tanks disappear. Take William Jefferson Jr. with you. Having the designer's son present will make it harder for them to block your access." Thompson, who had been quietly analyzing the Nevada test results, looked up with a troubled expression. "Jack, there's something else in these reports, something I missed earlier." He pointed to a section detailing crew survivability tests, where prototype tanks were subjected to simulated combat damage to assess crew protection systems. The Pioneer's compartmentalization design showed a 70% improvement in crew survival rates compared to contemporary designs. That's not just a technical advantage, that's American lives saved. The implication hung heavily in the air. By suppressing Jefferson's innovations, Collins and his allies hadn't just altered the historical record. They had potentially delayed the implementation of life-saving technologies in America's combat vehicles. Harmon's jaw tightened as he processed this revelation. His own survival in Desert Storm, which he had attributed to general improvements in tank design, might have been directly linked to Jefferson's innovations finally being incorporated, years later than they should have been, and without credit to their original creator. The discovery added moral weight to their mission, transforming it from a quest for historical accuracy into a matter of justice for both Jefferson and the tank crews whose lives had been unnecessarily endangered by political manipulation of technological development. As the team dispersed to execute their assigned tasks, Harmon remained behind with Thompson, examining the detailed test reports with the grim concentration of men who understood exactly what the dry, technical language represented in human terms. All these years, Harmon said quietly, I've been thanking the wrong people for my crew's survival. Thompson nodded solemnly. That's why this matters, Jack. Not just for Jefferson's legacy, but for the truth about how American innovation actually happens, not in committee rooms or political offices, but in the minds of brilliant individuals who often go uncredited. The next morning brought a flurry of activity as their plan unfolded across multiple fronts. Davis secured Senator Martinez's support for the Smithsonian request, which was formally submitted with expedited processing. Miller delivered her comprehensive historical brief to the museum curators, who recognized immediately the significance of Jefferson's previously uncredited contributions. Meanwhile, Rodriguez and Wilson arrived at Fort Hood with William Jefferson Jr., their presence creating an unexpected complication for the disposal team. The base commander, caught between conflicting political pressures, ultimately allowed them limited access to document the tanks one final time before processing. As Jefferson stood before one of his father's creations for the first time, his expression reflected profound emotion, pride mingled with lingering anger at the recognition denied for so many years. He used to come home exhausted but excited, Jefferson recalled, his hand resting on the tank's hull. Said he was working on something that would change everything, save lives. Now I finally understand what he meant. The moment was captured by a photographer from the base public affairs office, who had been assigned to document the disposal process. The image, Jefferson's son touching the tank his father had designed, with Rodriguez and Wilson standing respectfully nearby, would later become iconic, appearing in newspapers and magazines nationwide when the full story finally broke. In Washington, Harmon and Davis attended the preliminary hearing for NextGen's legal claim against the California tank. The proceedings took an unexpected turn when Howard Patton arrived with his own legal team, presenting documentation proving his legitimate ownership and challenging NextGen to specify exactly which proprietary technologies they claimed the tank contained. When NextGen's lawyers attempted to describe the suspension system without revealing classified details, Davis interrupted with a devastating question. Are you referring to the 8-wheel adaptive suspension system designed by William Jefferson in 1972, already documented in recently declassified Army records? The question, asked in open court, created exactly the public record they had hoped for, forcing NextGen to either acknowledge Jefferson's prior claim or perjure themselves by denying known facts. The company's lawyers requested an immediate recess to consult with their clients. By evening, the situation had evolved dramatically. Senator Martinez's office announced a formal investigation into the Pioneer program's termination, specifically examining whether racial bias had influenced the decision to suppress Jefferson's innovations. The Smithsonian issued a press release expressing great interest in acquiring a Pioneer tank for its forthcoming exhibition on African-American contributions to military technology. Most significantly, General Phillips, acting on his own authority, issued a temporary hold on the disposal of the Fort Hood tanks pending resolution of the Smithsonian's acquisition request, a bureaucratic maneuver that effectively prevented their immediate destruction. Collins, recognizing the rapidly shifting political landscape, attempted to contain the damage. Through intermediaries, he reached out to Davis suggesting a compromise, whereby one Pioneer tank would be preserved while the others would be quietly processed as planned. Davis brought the proposal to Harmon that evening as the team regrouped in their Washington headquarters. Collins is looking for a way to save face, Davis explained. He'll allow one tank to go to the Smithsonian with appropriate credit to Jefferson, if we agree to drop our broader investigation into the program's termination. Rodriguez scoffed at the suggestion. Half measures. One tank in a museum doesn't correct 40 years of erased history. It's a start, Miller countered pragmatically. Getting Jefferson's name permanently attached to even one pioneer in the Smithsonian would be a significant victory. The full historical record can still be established through academic channels over time. Harmon considered the options carefully, weighing immediate gains against long-term justice. The preservation of one tank was certainly better than losing all five, but accepting Collins's terms meant allowing him to avoid accountability for decades of historical manipulation. The decision was complicated by news from Fort Hood, where the disposal team remained on standby, awaiting resolution of the conflicting orders. The window for action was narrow and rapidly closing. "What about Jefferson's son?" Harmon asked finally. "This is his father's legacy. He should have a voice in the decision." When consulted by phone, William Jefferson Jr.'s response was measured but firm. "One tank isn't enough. My father designed an entire system that transformed American armor. His story deserves to be told completely, not as a footnote in someone else's narrative." His words crystallized the team's resolve. This wasn't merely about preserving artifacts. It was about restoring truth to the historical record and ensuring proper recognition for a brilliant engineer whose contributions had been systematically erased. "Tell Collins no deal," Harmon instructed Davis. "We proceed with full disclosure of everything we found, the Nevada tests, the suppressed innovations, and the direct connection to technologies still in use today." The decision set the stage for the final confrontation, a public reckoning decades in the making. With the tanks temporarily secured by General Phillips's administrative hold, they had gained precious time to prepare their comprehensive presentation of the evidence. That evening, as the team worked late into the night organizing their documentation, Harmon stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The Washington Monument stood illuminated in the distance, a reminder of the ideals upon which the nation had been founded. Ideals that included truth, justice, and recognition of merit, regardless of background. In his mind's eye, he saw again his own tank crew from Desert Storm, young men who had trusted their lives to the machine surrounding them. He thought of William Jefferson, the brilliant engineer who had designed systems that protected those men, yet never received proper acknowledgement for his innovations. "We'll set it right," Harmon promised quietly to the night air. "All of it." The path ahead remained challenging, with powerful interests aligned against them and significant obstacles still to overcome. But for the first time since beginning this mission, Harmon felt the momentum shifting in their favor. Truth, once uncovered, had a power all its own, a power that even senators and corporations would ultimately find impossible to contain. The morning of the Smithsonian presentation dawned with a weight of anticipation that had been building for decades. Colonel John Harmon stood at the window of his hotel room, watching the capital city come to life in the Pompeii autumn light. Washington's monuments and memorials gleamed in the distance, stone sentinels guarding the nation's stories, both those celebrated in marble and those buried in classified files. In 3 hours, they would present their evidence to a specially assembled panel that included Smithsonian curators, military historians, representatives from the Armed Services Committee, and selected members of the press. The culmination of their investigation would either restore William Jefferson's rightful place in military history or allow decades of deliberate erasure to stand unchallenged. Harmon adjusted his tie, the familiar routine of military precision providing comfort amid uncertainty. His reflection in the mirror showed a man whose years of command had etched determination into every line of his face. Today would not be a battle fought with steel and firepower, but with truth and evidence against the entrenched forces of political convenience and corporate profit. His phone vibrated with an incoming message from Davis. "Collins making last-minute moves. Pentagon officials being pressured to withdraw. Martinez standing firm, proceeding as planned." So Collins was still fighting, trying to empty the room of potential allies. Harmon had expected nothing less. Men who buried history rarely welcomed its excavation. The team gathered in the hotel lobby, each carrying the weight of responsibility in their own way. Rodriguez arrived first, his formal suit a sharp departure from his usual practical attire, the polished shoes and pressed shirt an unspoken testament to the day's importance. Wilson followed, quiet and composed, carrying the technical documentation they had compiled with such painstaking care. Miller joined them, her professional demeanor masking the scholarly excitement of a historian about to correct a significant historical injustice. William Jefferson Jr. was the last to arrive, his posture reflecting both the burden and pride of representing his father's legacy. The past weeks had transformed him, Harmon observed, from a cautious skeptic to a determined advocate for his father's recognition. "Everyone ready?" Harmon asked, receiving solemn nods in response. The question was largely ceremonial. They had prepared meticulously for this moment. As their vehicles approached the Smithsonian complex, Harmon noticed a larger-than-expected media presence. News vans lined the curb, and reporters with camera crews positioned themselves near the entrance. "That's not just military press," Miller observed, noting the diverse array of news organizations represented. "Someone made sure this story got wider attention." Davis smiled slightly. "Senator Martinez has friends at the major networks. She made some calls after yesterday's committee briefing. Said the American people deserve to know about one of their unsung heroes." The unexpected media presence represented both opportunity and challenge. Greater public awareness would make it harder for Collins to bury the story again, but it also raised the stakes considerably. Any mistakes or overstatements would be amplified, potentially undermining their credibility. Inside, they were escorted to a conference room where the distinguished panel awaited. At the center sat Dr. Eleanor Richards, the Smithsonian's formidable director of military history collections, flanked by curators and historians. Representatives from various government agencies occupied one side of the table, while journalists were seated in the back, notebooks and recorders at the ready. Notable by his absence was Senator Collins himself, though two of his senior aides were present, their expressions professionally neutral but eyes watchful. Dr. Richards opened the proceedings with academic precision. "We are gathered to evaluate evidence regarding the historical significance of the M60 Pioneer tank program, particularly the contributions of engineer William Jefferson, and to determine whether these vehicles merit preservation in the national collection. Colonel Harmon, you may begin your presentation." Harmon approached the podium, years of military briefings evident in his composed demeanor. Behind him, a screen displayed the first of their carefully prepared slides, a photograph of the Pioneer tank at Fort Hood, majestic despite decades of neglect. "Distinguished panel members, thank you for this opportunity. What we present today isn't merely about preserving machines of war, but about restoring truth to our military history and acknowledging the brilliant mind whose innovations have protected American soldiers for generations." For the next 30 minutes, Harmon laid out the core of their case: the technical brilliance of Jefferson's designs, the documented performance of the Pioneer tanks, and the deliberate process by which his contributions had been obscured from the historical record. Miller followed with a historian's analysis of how the narrative had been altered, tracing the paper trail of revised reports, reclassified documents, and reassigned credit that had effectively erased Jefferson from official accounts. Rodriguez and Wilson provided technical testimony, explaining in terms accessible to non-specialists how Jefferson's innovations had revolutionized tank design, particularly the 8-wheel suspension system and crew compartmentalization that had saved countless lives. Throughout their presentations, the room remained silent save for the scratching of pens on notepads and the occasional murmur of surprise at particularly compelling evidence. The journalists in the back leaned forward during key revelations, their expressions indicating they recognized the significance of what was being disclosed. When William Jefferson Jr. rose to speak, the atmosphere shifted. This was no longer merely an academic or technical matter, but a deeply personal one, a son standing for his father's rightful recognition. "My father never spoke much about his work," Jefferson began, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "He believed in service without expectation of praise, but he also believed in truth and fairness. In the final years of his life, he told me that his greatest work had been taken from him, though he never explained exactly what he meant." He held up one of his father's journals, its pages worn with age. In these private writings, he documented not only his technical innovations, but also the systematic way in which his contributions were minimized, divided among committees, and eventually credited to others. He accepted this injustice with dignity, but he also preserved the truth, perhaps hoping that someday it would be known. The personal testimony added emotional resonance to their carefully constructed case, putting a human face on what might otherwise have remained an abstract historical correction. As the presentation neared its conclusion, Davis introduced their most explosive evidence, The Nevada test results that showed the Pioneer outperforming contemporary designs, including early Abrams prototypes, followed by documentation of then Colonel Collins's immediate recommendation to terminate the program despite those results. One of Collins's aides shifted uncomfortably as the connection was made explicit. The assembled journalists scribbled furiously, recognizing the significance of a sitting senator being implicated in the deliberate suppression of military innovation for personal advancement. Harmon returned to the podium for their closing statement, conscious that this moment represented the culmination of their weeks-long investigation. The evidence we presented today tells a story that extends far beyond the technical specifications of a tank design. It's a story about innovation suppressed, recognition denied, and most critically, about technologies that could have saved even more American lives had they been fully implemented when first developed. He paused, allowing his next words to carry their full weight. My own survival in Desert Storm, when my tank took a direct hit that should have been fatal to my crew, was likely due to design elements that William Jefferson pioneered 20 years earlier. Elements that were only partially incorporated into production models after his original work was buried. The room fell silent as the implications registered. This wasn't merely an academic exercise in historical correction, but a matter that had directly affected American servicemen's lives. We're not here to assign blame or seek retribution, Harmon continued, though his eyes briefly met those of Collins's representatives. We're here to ensure that history records the truth, that William Jefferson receives the recognition he earned through his genius, and that the tanks that embody his innovations are preserved as the national treasures they truly are. As Harmon concluded, Dr. Richards thanked the team for their presentation and announced a brief recess for the panel to confer. The room buzzed with conversation as they filed out, journalists already beginning to draft their stories, clearly recognizing they had witnessed something significant. In the hallway outside, Thompson was waiting, having attended as an observer rather than a presenter due to his former position within the Pentagon hierarchy. His expression was cautiously optimistic. "You laid out a compelling case," he said quietly. "Even Collins's people look concerned. They know how this will play in the press if they try to block preservation now." "It's not over yet," Harmon cautioned, too experienced to celebrate prematurely. "Collins has powerful allies and a vested interest in maintaining the current narrative." As if summoned by his name, a commotion at the end of the hall announced the unexpected arrival of Senator Richard Collins himself, tall and distinguished at 72, with silver hair and the confident bearing of a man accustomed to wielding influence. Collins strode towards them, flanked by aides and security personnel. "Colonel Harmon," he said, his voice carrying the practiced cordiality of a career politician, "I was hoping we might speak privately before the panel reconvenes." Harmon nodded, signaling his team to give them space. This confrontation had been inevitable since they began their investigation. "Senator Collins, I'm surprised to see you here. Your office indicated you wouldn't be attending." "Plans change when the stakes are high enough." Collins gestured toward an empty meeting room. "Shall we?" Inside, with the door closed, Collins's demeanor shifted subtly, the political charm giving way to the calculated intensity that had propelled his rise through Washington's power structures. "You've created quite a stir, Colonel, resurrecting classified programs, making accusations about procurement decisions that were made for national security reasons, involving the Smithsonian in what should be an internal Defense Department matter. We presented documented facts, Senator, nothing classified, just information that was deliberately buried." Collins waved a dismissive hand. "Context matters, Colonel. Those decisions were made in a different time, under different pressures. The Cold War required difficult choices, including denying proper credit to an African-American engineer whose innovations revolutionized tank design." Harmon kept his tone neutral, but the question itself carried an unmistakable edge. Collins's eyes narrowed fractionally. "That's an inflammatory accusation with no place in a serious discussion of military procurement history." "It's a documented fact, Senator. William Jefferson's name was systematically removed from technical reports he authored. His innovations were subdivided and reassigned to committees. And you personally recommended terminating the Pioneer program immediately after test results showed it outperforming the alternatives in which you had political and possibly financial interests." The senator's jaw tightened, the only visible sign that Harmon's words had landed with impact. When he spoke again, his voice had lowered, the public persona giving way to the hard-edged political operator beneath. "Let me be direct, Colonel. I still have significant influence with the Armed Services Committee and the Defense Department. This crusade of yours could have repercussions for the tank museum's funding, for your former colleagues still in service, perhaps even for the pensions and benefits of your team members. The threat, though carefully phrased to maintain plausible deniability, was unmistakable. Collins was offering a choice: back down or face consequences that would extend beyond Harmon himself to those who had supported his investigation. Harmon met the senator's gaze steadily, neither intimidated nor surprised. Men like Collins had spent decades using such tactics to maintain their carefully constructed narratives. You should know, Senator, that complete documentation of our findings has already been distributed to multiple secure locations, with instructions for release if any adverse actions are taken against anyone involved in this investigation. The Smithsonian has copies, so does the Library of Congress, and several reputable journalists. Collins's expression didn't change, but a subtle tension in his shoulders suggested the message had registered. Furthermore, Harmon continued, William Jefferson Jr. has already been approached by several publishers interested in his father's story. The truth will be told, with or without official acknowledgement. For several long moments, Collins said nothing, reassessing his position in light of this new information. When he finally spoke, his tone had shifted from threat to pragmatic negotiation. What exactly do you want, Colonel? Preservation of the tanks? Fine. A plaque acknowledging Jefferson's contributions? That can be arranged. But dragging decades-old procurement decisions into the public eye serves no productive purpose. What we want is the full truth on the historical record. Jefferson's role properly acknowledged in military engineering history, and yes, preservation of the remaining Pioneer tanks as the significant historical artifacts they are. And the procurement decisions? My role in the program's termination? Harmon considered carefully. Their goal had never been personal retribution against Collins, despite the senator's decades of benefiting from Jefferson's erased innovations. That history will be recorded accurately, but our focus is on Jefferson's positive contributions, not on assigning blame for their suppression. The historical record will speak for itself. Collins studied him, calculating political costs and benefits with the efficiency of a man who had survived decades in Washington's unforgiving environment. Finally, he nodded once. I'll instruct my office to withdraw any objections to the tank's preservation. Jefferson's contributions can be properly acknowledged in the historical record. In return, I expect this matter to be handled with the appropriate historical context and perspective. The compromise, while imperfect, represented a significant victory for their core mission: preserving the Pioneer tanks and ensuring Jefferson's rightful place in military history. The full accounting of Collins's role might not come immediately, but with the primary evidence preserved and the basic facts established, that truth would inevitably emerge over time. As they returned to the main hall, Harmon noticed William Jefferson Jr. in conversation with Dr. Richards and several Smithsonian curators, their animated discussion suggesting positive developments. Rodriguez and Wilson stood nearby, their posture relaxed for the first time in weeks, while Miller was engaged with journalists, her historian's precision ensuring accurate reporting of their findings. Before the panel reconvened, Harmon received an unexpected call from Captain Reynolds at Fort Hood. Colonel, thought you should know. The disposal team has been officially stood down. New orders came through classifying the Pioneer tanks as historical assets pending transfer to appropriate preservation facilities. Sounds like you won, sir. Not just me, Captain. A lot of people fought for this outcome, but thank you for letting me know. The formal announcement came 30 minutes later. Dr. Richards, speaking with the measured authority of her position, confirmed that the Smithsonian would be acquiring 2 Pioneer tanks for permanent preservation, one for the American History Museum's Military Innovation Exhibition, and one for the National Museum of African American History and Culture, specifically highlighting Jefferson's contributions. The remaining tanks would be preserved at the Army Ordnance Museum at Fort Lee and at the Tank Museum in Arizona, with full historical documentation acknowledging Jefferson's role in their development. Most significantly, the official historical record would be corrected to properly credit William Jefferson as the principal designer of the revolutionary suspension and crew protection systems that had influenced American tank design for generations. As the announcement concluded to appreciative applause, Harmon felt a profound sense of completion, not merely of their immediate mission, but of a debt of honor decades in the making. Across the room, William Jefferson Jr. stood tall, emotion visible in his eyes but dignity in his bearing, a son who had finally secured his father's rightful legacy. The following morning brought the first wave of media coverage, with major newspapers and networks reporting on the pioneering African-American engineer whose tank innovations had been erased from military history. The stories focused primarily on Jefferson's technical brilliance and the belated recognition of his contributions, with only passing references to the political factors that had led to his historical erasure. Collins had apparently used his considerable influence to minimize his own role in the narrative, but the essential truth had emerged. William Jefferson's genius would now be properly acknowledged in American military history. 6 months later, Harmon stood in the gleaming new exhibition hall at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, where Pioneer Tank Number 4 occupied a position of honor, restored to its original condition. Beside it, interactive displays detailed Jefferson's innovations and their impact on American armor development, while photographs showed the engineer at work during the program's development phase. William Jefferson Jr. stood nearby, proudly explaining his father's work to a group of engineering students from Howard University, his hands tracing the tank's revolutionary suspension system with the inherited understanding of a son raised in the shadow of engineering brilliance. Rodriguez and Wilson had traveled from Texas and California respectively for the exhibition's opening, both men standing straighter in their formal attire, pride evident in their bearing as they witnessed the culmination of their efforts. Miller moved professionally through the crowd, answering journalists' questions with scholarly precision, ensuring the historical record was accurately represented in the day's coverage. Thompson and Davis conversed quietly in a corner, the two older men sharing the satisfied exhaustion of veteran campaigners who had fought one final, significant battle. As visitors streamed through the exhibition, Harmon noticed their expressions of surprise and admiration as they learned Jefferson's story, the narrative of American innovation expanding before their eyes to include a brilliant mind that history had temporarily erased. A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "Quite the achievement, Colonel." Harmon turned to find Senator Collins standing beside him, examining the tank with practiced political interest. The senator had positioned himself adroitly in the aftermath, publicly praising the long overdue recognition of American innovation, while distancing himself from the historical suppression of Jefferson's contributions. "The achievement was Jefferson's, Senator. We just helped restore the record." Collins nodded, political pragmatism accepting the new reality. "History is always more complicated than the official narratives, isn't it? Written and rewritten by those with the power to shape it. Until someone cares enough to correct it," Harmon replied simply. The senator studied him thoughtfully. "You know, in different circumstances, we might have worked well together. You have an admirable persistence." "Perhaps, but I prefer serving under those who value truth over convenience." Collins accepted the implicit rebuke with a slight nod. "The world rarely offers such clean distinctions, Colonel, but I respect your conviction, even when it proved inconvenient to my interests." With that, the senator moved away, seamlessly joining a group of congressional representatives touring the exhibition, his political instincts already finding ways to associate himself with the positive aspects of Jefferson's newly recognized legacy. Harmon watched him go, neither resentful nor reconciled. Men like Collins operated according to their own moral calculus, and while justice had ultimately prevailed in this case, the senator would likely continue unchallenged in most of his endeavors. A more welcome interruption came as William Jefferson Jr. approached, accompanied by an elderly African-American man walking with the assistance of a cane. "Colonel Harmon, I'd like you to meet someone special. This is Master Sergeant James Williams, retired. He worked with my father during the Pioneer program." The elderly man extended a weathered hand, which Harmon clasped with respect. "A pleasure to meet you, Master Sergeant." "Likewise, Colonel. When young William told me about what you'd done, getting his father's work recognized after all these years, I knew I had to be here. I was chief test driver during the development phase, spent hundreds of hours in that very tank." He nodded toward the Pioneer. "Jefferson was a genius, pure and simple, way ahead of his time." "Did you know what happened? How his contributions were erased?" Williams's expression clouded slightly. "We had our suspicions. Wasn't unusual in those days for certain people's work to be reallocated. But William never complained, just kept improving his designs, focused on making machines that would keep our boys safe in combat. That safety was his legacy," Harmon said quietly. "Those designs saved my crew in Desert Storm." The older man nodded solemnly. Then he succeeded in what mattered most to him. He used to say, "The machines serve the men, not the other way around." always designed with the crew's survival as his priority. As William shared memories of working with Jefferson during the program's development, Harmon found himself reflecting on how a single individual's commitment to excellence and truth could resonate across decades, influencing lives far beyond their immediate circle. Jefferson had never known that his innovations had saved Harmon's crew in the Iraqi desert, just as Harmon had never known whose genius had protected him until their investigation began. Yet the connection had been there all along, an invisible thread of innovation and protection linking designer and commander across time. Later that evening, as the formal ceremonies concluded, Harmon found a moment of solitude in the now empty exhibition hall. The Pioneer tank stood illuminated by carefully designed lighting, its angular silhouette casting long shadows across the polished floor. He approached the machine, resting his hand on its hull as he had done at Fort Hood when they first began their investigation. Now, however, the touch carried different significance. Not discovery, but recognition. Not rescue, but honor. "We got it right," he said quietly to the empty hall. The words meant for Jefferson, for his own crew from Desert Storm, and for all those whose lives had been protected by innovations whose origins they would never know. A plaque beside the tank now bore Jefferson's name and a simple description of his contribution. William Jefferson, 1932 to 2013, principal designer of the revolutionary suspension and crew protection systems that transformed American tank design. His innovations saved countless lives and continue to influence armored vehicle development today. The words were modest compared to the magnitude of Jefferson's contribution, but they represented something profound: the correction of a historical injustice and the restoration of truth to the record of American military innovation. As Harmon turned to leave, he noticed William Jefferson Jr. standing in the doorway, observing him with quiet understanding. "My father would have appreciated this," Jefferson said, joining Harmon beside the tank. "Not the recognition itself, he never sought that, but the acknowledgement that his work mattered, that it protected American soldiers." "It protected me," Harmon replied simply, "and my crew. We owe him a debt that can never be fully repaid." Jefferson smiled slightly. "In our family tradition, debts are settled by passing forward the obligation, not backward. Your work to restore my father's legacy honors him more than any plaque or exhibition ever could." The two men stood in companionable silence, each connected to the Pioneer tank through different but complementary bonds. The son through blood and heritage, the commander through combat and survival. "What will you do now?" Jefferson asked eventually. "Return to the museum in Arizona?" Harmon nodded. "There's always more history to preserve, more stories to tell correctly, and we're receiving one of the Pioneers next month. I'd be honored if you'd consider consulting on the exhibition design." "I'd like that. Continuing my father's story, making sure it's told properly." As they prepared to leave, Jefferson paused for one last look at the tank that embodied his father's genius. "You know, he never doubted that someday the truth would emerge. He told me once that real innovation can't be permanently suppressed, that genuine solutions find their way into use even when the innovator goes uncredited." A wise man. He was, and he would have appreciated knowing that his work saved lives, your life, even when his name had been removed from the designs. Outside the museum, Washington's monuments glowed in the evening light, stone tributes to the nation's history and ideals. Among them now, in the climate-controlled halls of the Smithsonian, stood a different kind of monument, a steel testament to American innovation and to the principle that truth, however long delayed, would eventually find its voice. 1 year later, Harmon stood at the podium in the Tank Museum's new exhibition hall in Arizona, addressing the gathered crowd at the official opening of the Pioneers of American Armor exhibition. The centerpiece, Pioneer Tank Number 17, gleamed under carefully designed lighting, restored to operational condition through Rodriguez's painstaking efforts. The crowd included veterans, military historians, current service members, and civilians with an interest in military technology. In the front row sat William Jefferson Jr. and his family, including 2 teenage grandchildren of the engineer whose work they were celebrating. "This exhibition represents more than the technical evolution of American armor," Harmon began, surveying the attentive faces before him. "It tells the story of the men and women whose innovation and dedication produced machines that protected American soldiers through decades of conflict." He gestured toward the Pioneer tank. "This vehicle embodies a particularly significant chapter in that story. one that was nearly lost to history through deliberate omission. The contributions of William Jefferson to American tank design represent not just technical brilliance, but moral purpose. The unwavering commitment to protecting the lives of the men who would take these machines into combat. Around the exhibition hall, interactive displays detail Jefferson's innovations and their impact on subsequent tank designs, including direct connections to the Abrams tanks that had dominated battlefields from Desert Storm to more recent conflicts. Videos showed tank crews describing how enhanced mobility and protection systems had saved lives in combat, creating a direct line from Jefferson's drawing board to battlefield survival. As a tank commander in Desert Storm, I experienced firsthand the life-saving value of Jefferson's innovations, though I didn't know their origin until our investigation began. When my tank took a direct hit that should have been fatal, Jefferson's crew compartmentalization system, incorporated into later designs, saved my entire crew. The personal testimony added emotional weight to the technical displays, connecting Jefferson's engineering principles to their human impact. This exhibition honors not just the machines but the minds behind them, particularly those minds whose contributions were overlooked or deliberately obscured in official histories. It stands as a reminder that American innovation comes from many sources, and that genuine talent and dedication can transcend even deliberate attempts at historical erasure. As the ceremony concluded and visitors began exploring the exhibition, Harmon found himself standing beside the Pioneer tank with Rodriguez, Wilson, and Miller, the core team that had made this moment possible. "Mission accomplished," Rodriguez said quietly, satisfaction evident in his voice as he watched visitors examining the technical displays with interest. "More than accomplished," Miller added. "The historical record has been permanently corrected. Jefferson's place in military engineering history is now secure." Wilson nodded toward the group of young engineering students clustered around one of the interactive displays. "And a new generation is learning the full story. That's what matters most. The truth being carried forward." Harmon watched as William Jefferson Jr. explained his father's innovations to his grandchildren, their young faces alight with pride and interest. The continuity across generations embodied exactly what their mission had sought to achieve. Not just historical correction, but ongoing recognition of genius that had transcended attempts at erasure. As the day progressed, Harmon found a moment of solitude beside the tank, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. What had begun as a mission to preserve historical artifacts had evolved into something far more significant: the restoration of truth to the narrative of American military innovation and the recognition of brilliance that had saved countless lives. The Pioneer tank stood as a monument not just to mechanical ingenuity, but to the enduring power of truth to overcome even deliberate suppression. In its gleaming hull and revolutionary systems, Jefferson's genius lived on, finally acknowledged and celebrated for the protective innovation it had always been. Harmon rested his hand briefly on the tank's surface, feeling once again the connection between designer and commander, between innovation and protection, between past and present. "Steel legacy," he murmured. Words meant only for himself and for the spirits of those who had designed, built, and fought in these remarkable machines. Around him, the exhibition buzzed with visitors discovering Jefferson's story for the first time, his innovations now rightfully central to the narrative of American armored warfare. The correction of history was complete, not as revision, but as restoration, the truth finally emerging from decades of deliberate obscurity. And in that truth lay the most fitting memorial to William Jefferson. Not just the preserved tanks or explanatory plaques, but the recognition that his genius had served its highest purpose: the protection of American soldiers who would never know his name, but whose lives had been saved by his unwavering commitment to their survival. That was the true steel legacy, not the machines themselves, but the bond between those who designed them with protective purpose and those whose lives had been shielded by that distant, anonymous care. A legacy forged in steel, preserved in truth, and honored at last.